Joining us for this discussion, we're very pleased to welcome our special guest, Todd Stern. As former Special Envoy for Climate Change at the State Department, Todd spearheaded the nation's international climate change agenda and led the negotiating team that helped clinch the landmark deal at Paris. And the success at Paris capped his nearly two-decade-long career in climate diplomacy. Leading the discussion with Todd will be Sue Biniaz, Todd's former colleague at the State Department, a distinguished fellow at EPIC, and lecturer at the law school here this quarter. Sue was the lead climate lawyer for the State Department, and as such was a key member of Todd's team. We have been thrilled to have Sue with us here at the university this quarter. I should mention that this is Sue's last week here. And so for all of you who've had an opportunity to engage with Sue and spend time with her, you know, as I do, what an incredible asset and an incredible experience this has been having Sue. And so we're very excited to have Sue do this last event with us on campus this week. With that, please join me in welcoming Todd and Sue.
Start off asking Todd about the mitigation commitments or the emission reduction commitments under the agreement. When we and other countries were trying to figure out how to approach mitigation commitments, we essentially had three options before us. One was that we would negotiate everybody's emission targets, and that seemed really not feasible or realistic because we were trying to bring the entire world into this agreement, unlike the Kyoto Protocol. And how do you negotiate 196 targets? It seems unwieldy, coupled with the fact that the large developing countries would probably be highly resistant to negotiating their targets. That was one option. Another option was you take the temperature goal and you figure out how much that translates into in terms of global emissions, and you allocate targets to each country. And that seemed even more unrealistic than option number one, because which country would sit still for being told, here's your allocation. So the third option was that each country would nationally determine its own commitment, and the United States kind of landed on this idea and promoted it. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about is maybe a little bit about the derivation or how you promoted the idea of nationally determined, and then, do you think you could actually argue that self-defined targets have a higher chance of being implemented in real life than the other options?
Okay, so I promise I'm going to get to those questions very quickly. I have a couple of preliminary points of order. First of all, I want you all to understand that not only is Sue Biniaz, I'm sure, a great asset here, but Sue Biniaz is literally the most important lawyer on climate change in the world, and that's I'm not joking. That is absolutely true, and including those who would like to string her up because she's so difficult. When the chips are down and the actual results have to happen toward the end of a COP, even her enemies want her in the room. So you're very privileged to have had her at the University of Chicago. So that's point of order number one. Point of order number two is it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm a Chicago guy, so it's my hometown. I love Chicago, and it's probably a testament to how what anxious and difficult times we are all living in Washington and radiating around the world, that 2 days went by after the Bulls made this shocking trade before I texted my brother to say, what the hell happened here? Because they're so preoccupied with what we have to deal with in Washington. But anyway, I'm very glad to be here. Always happy to be in Chicago and great to be at the university. So now to go to Sue's questions. I think that, maybe a couple of things that I would say about mitigation targets and the issue of negotiating them or having them be nationally determined. I cut my teeth in the first instance on climate in 1997 when I was working in the Clinton White House, and I was minding my own business, doing work that had nothing to do with this. But I got drafted into I got drafted from time to time into working on special projects outside the four corners of the job that I was doing, and the time that was the most consequential when that happened was about 5 or 6 months before Kyoto, and was asked to jump in and work on the White House team on this. So I ended up being in Kyoto, and my experience in Kyoto was largely being part of this three-cornered negotiation between the US, the EU, and Japan, big dominant developed countries. Remember, in Kyoto, developing countries weren't being asked to do anything, so they had a kind of spoiler role where they could throw tomatoes at things they didn't like, but the real obligations that were on the table in Kyoto didn't involve them, and it was a kind of endless, difficult negotiation of who was going to do what on targets, and everybody having to agree on not just their own target, but on everybody else's. So having seen that from just three major, more or less aligned developed countries, then you fast forward to the Obama administration, and when we were starting to work on what became the Paris Agreement, the notion that you could have an international negotiation with all of these different players in the room actually negotiating each other's targets, completely not possible. And similarly, the essential ingredient for a new agreement was going to be that everybody had to be part of it. I mean, this was not going to be, the very first thing I knew coming in, and Sue and I got together any number of times, even before the Obama administration started, once I could see that this job was coming at me. The critical thing was we had done Kyoto, we did that, we weren't going back to that. Been there, done that, and it failed, right, in terms of any capacity for the United States to be part of it. So that basic paradigm of the developed countries are going to do a whole bunch of things, and the developing countries, including China and India and others, are not. It was just like a dead letter for the United States, and that was perfectly obvious. So as we started ramping up toward sort of post-Durban, which is the 2011 Conference of the Parties, the COPs. There's one of these that happens every year. We knew that we had to have an agreement that everybody was going to be part of, and we kind of thought back to a proposal that the Australians had put forward in a different form, but had elements that were I think quite useful, which was, and they had done this early, 2009 or 10. The notion was that countries should put forward, and the word they used was their own schedules. That was like a trade word. But it's the same idea. So we started, I can't remember if we or somebody else came up with the actual notion of nationally determined. At one point it was nationally determined commitments. The word commitment fell off for reasons that I won't pause on right now unless somebody wants to ask. But so that became that structural feature of what became Paris was absolutely essential, because again, we had to have everybody in. The only way you could really have everybody in a way that was practical was if countries felt that a mitigation regime was not getting imposed upon them. It raised other questions of wanting to make sure that what countries put forward was as ambitious as possible, but it was crucial that countries could feel that they had control. Developing countries, this was historically very, very divided, very acrimoniously divided negotiation going all the way back to the early 90s, and developing countries generally had the sense that you guys, you developed countries, messed everything up. You created all of the, you created climate change through your emissions. Now we're being asked to fix it. It's fundamentally unfair. So dealing with that problem, you had to be able to and fundamentally unfair. And by doing what you're asking us to do, we're gonna completely compromise our capacity to grow and develop, and we can't do that. So you had to be able to say, nope, you're going to be able to make your own decision about what you do. It's crucial for everybody to move in the right direction, but nobody's going to force you to do something that you think is incompatible with economic growth and development. So, have I answered the question? I think.
Yep. What about the chance of implementation? Domestic implementation? Well,
I mean, I think it almost goes without saying that it's all sort of part of the same underlying dynamic. If a country is able to say to look at its own situation and say, this is what we can do, then there's a much better chance that the country is going to be comfortable with what's been put forward because they've done it and bought into the notion of implementing it. Because you don't have some outside, I mean, the U.S. might have more of a black helicopter mentality about the UN than other countries, but you still would have other countries thinking like, what do you mean you're telling us we have to do this? And if you have any doubt, I don't want to get far afield here, but if you have any doubt about how countries like it when somebody else tells them what they have to do, take a look at what the EU's unsuccessful experiment in doing that in the world of aviation, which we can talk about later if somebody wants to ask, but it didn't work. And so, yes, absolutely, if countries have put in their own, much better chance that they'll actually do it. Now, hopefully that will get borne out.
Great. Okay, so by the time we got to Paris, over 180 countries had put forward or submitted their nationally determined targets. So it was quite a successful, in that sense, paradigm. But when those targets were added up, and most of them were in the 2030 range, about 3 countries put in 2025 targets, including the US. But when they were added up, it looked like they weren't really going to meet the global temperature goal of 2 degrees or below 2 degrees. So one thing we wanted to ask you about is, how does the Paris Agreement deal with that fact? China, going into the negotiations, wanted it to be a one-off agreement. Everybody puts in their targets, and that's it. Most countries in the world didn't agree with that and wanted it to be a longer-term agreement. But can you describe sort of what are the Paris mechanisms for trying to achieve a goal?
Sure. So we were very focused from the beginning on this being a lasting agreement, a durable agreement, and one that you wouldn't be going back to the well to renegotiate a whole structure every 10 years or whatever. But you're getting the architecture and the framework in place, and then it keeps renewing itself. So a few things I think were critical. First of all, at the level of trying to encourage the best targets possible in the first instance, given, again, that they were nationally determined, so up to a country to put forward its own, we thought a lot about how to incentivize ambition here, and which actually wasn't easy, but the best thing that we came up with, and that ended up being part of the regime, was the notion that there would basically be 2 steps in the target taking process. The first being that you would, or put it another way, maybe 2 steps isn't quite the right way to say it, but that you would be countries would be urged to put their submissions, their targets forward early in the process. So early in the process, meaning if you think Paris is 2015, it was going to be a 2015 agreement, we were arguing for the first quarter of 2015 as a point when targets would be put forward, with the notion that they would, not so much with the notion which the EU adopted actually, that there would be a kind of intensive process that would be articulated in various ways, where countries would have to defend what they were doing, and others would tell them they had to put in a higher target, because we worried that countries would react badly to that. In fact, it happened, and that it would feel a little bit contradictory to the notion of nationally determined. What we did want, though, and what we thought was, once you submit, and countries know that what they put forward is going to be submitted to the sunshine, if you will, that everybody's going to see it, that other countries can comment on it, and think tanks and civil society and the press, that exposure is going to, would encourage them, would kind of goad them into doing the best that they can. Because in most cases, interestingly, countries actually care a lot. Not everybody, but countries often, I think mostly, care a lot about their image. So we pushed for the first quarter. We didn't get the first quarter. We got the first quarter for those who, there's so many ways you can sidetrack here to get into the details of how particular lines we've got worked out in these negotiations. So I will resist the temptation to do that. But suffice it to say, it was the first quarter for those who are ready to do so, and basically as early as possible, as far in advance of Paris as possible for others. And I think that actually did have a useful effect as compared to the notion that countries would, drop their submission at the 11th hour during the Paris Agreement, the notion of that being something that might have happened was very real. I mean, that's essentially sort of what happened in Copenhagen, and although in Copenhagen, most countries hadn't even managed to get what they were talking about doing before those negotiations. All right, so that's kind of a preliminary point. I think the most important element that's baked into the negotiations is the notion of cycles. We knew absolutely for dead certain that we would not be on the track to hold temperature increase below 2 degrees based on what was going to be put forward going into Paris, because you just weren't going to get there that fast. I mean, where we have to go globally to actually get on a 2-degree path is extremely ambitious, and it's going to take an enormous amount of work. And you just weren't going to be able to start there. But we thought start as ambitiously as you possibly can, and then build in two kinds of cyclical reviews. One is a review of the aggregate, the so-called global stock take in the language of the agreement, that would happen every 5 years. A sort of proto version of that is scheduled for 2018. And then 2023 and 2028 and so forth, where the examination is how is the world in the aggregate doing as against our goals. The second is a review of individual country targets with a kind of intention to goad countries into doing better. Now, in some cases, the U.S. is an example of this. Our target goes to 2025, so in 2020 will be the first period of individual reviews. It will be a time for the U.S., assuming this administration is still playing in this game, which is not clear yet, to put forward their target for 2030. But even for countries that have already taken a 2030 target, the intention is certainly to provide a moment to kind of ratchet up and increase. Let me give you an example with respect to China. So China, we had a very intensive U.S.-China bilateral negotiation about our targets in 2014, which led to the kind of famous joint announcement by Presidents Obama and Xi in Beijing in November of 2014. Probably still the single biggest event leading to a positive outcome in Paris. But so China laid out their target. It is quite, in fact, possible, not just theoretically possible, but looking at the way the Chinese development has happened and is going on right now. It's quite possible that by 2020, it's going to be ridiculously clear that China is going to sail past the target that it articulated in 2015. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on China to not just hold to its 2030 target, but to ramp that up. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Again, I think the fact of the administration that we have now in the United States is going to tend to put less pressure on China to do that just inherently. But anyway, those, and I also think, by the way, that although these initial targets, as Sue said, were mostly targets, essentially 10-year targets that would go from 2020 to 2030, there's certainly language in the agreement that is encouraging, if not requiring, of the notion that post-2030 the targets will all be actually on 5-year cycles. I don't know. I think those are the most important elements. So I guess the one other thing I would say is we were very, very focused on negotiating a strong transparency regime. I think we're going to get to that in another question soon. But transparency, or what is sometimes called MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. That's the system whereby countries say, here's what we're doing, and other countries can look. And it's meant to keep people honest, and it's meant to, you actually can't really have an international agreement without that, because countries are not going to feel motivated or willing to kind of do their best unless they know that their competitors and their partners are also taking action, because they're not going to want to be caught. Sort of a tragedy of the commons issue. You've got to be able to see what other people are doing to feel confident about acting.
Yeah, well then I did want to ask about transparency next, because that's so critical to promoting on the ground implementation. And it was really important to the United States and many other countries, not just developed countries, to move away from the existing paradigm, which had developed countries doing kind of intensive reporting on their emissions and how they were implementing their targets, and developing countries had almost, had very few requirements in terms of such reporting and review. So the U.S. wanted to move away from these sort of rigid categories towards a much more of a continuum where everybody was in the same system, and that was one of the issues that was worked out with China in the course of the years right before Paris. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about how that issue was worked out with China.
So first of all, just a little background note. My very first meeting on the Hill in 2009, so I come in January 2009, and my very first meeting, which was in February on the Hill, was with then Senator John Kerry. And his most important message to me at that meeting, which I still remember very clearly, was, and he's a huge, big, you guys probably know, he has been a huge, big supporter of climate action forever. He was the senator, sort of paramount, who would show up at all the COPs and followed this closely, and was kind of right in there with, with the president of the creation, with Al Gore and Tim Wirth and others in the Senate who were focused on this issue. But he said transparency, MRV, is the word he used. You got to get that. People here, and he was talking about here in the Senate, are not going to believe that China's, even if you get China to say something that they're going to do, that they're going to take action, nobody's going to believe it unless there's a real MRV system. So you gotta get that. And that was not a surprise to me, but it was, there's certainly words that I took on board. So very important for the reasons that Sue and I have already just said. The two things were paramount to us with respect to what we needed to get in a way that applied to everybody, or at least all the big countries, without a separation between developed and developing. And that's reporting, first of all, reporting on a regular basis, because this is whatever reporting was coming out of developing countries up until that point was very, very, very periodic. I mean, irregular. Not really periodic, irregular. It could, many years could go by before anything was reported. And there was no need to report on progress made toward implementing targets. And there was, again, very weak requirements, both with respect to timing and content regarding inventories. And inventories, what your emissions are and how they're composed and how you're doing with respect to your emissions, that's kind of the foundation. So we needed strong inventories, and we needed a system that was going to apply to everybody. And also, just kind of conceptually, you can imagine, and indeed it's totally appropriate to have various kinds of treatment of developing countries that's cognizant of their own capacities, but it doesn't really make sense to say, developed countries need to be clear, and developing countries, particularly the more the larger and more potent among them don't need to be clear. So we were very, very keen on having essentially a single system. We also wanted to reassure countries, because there's a lot of developing countries that don't have much capacity, that are small and poor, and we wanted to reassure them that they were not going to get caught up in some kind of a vice that where they were asked to do more than they could do. So we were for the notion of flexibility. Various kinds of flexibilities could apply to timing, could apply to content of what they needed to put forward, but it should relate to capacity. It shouldn't relate to simply these two categories of countries that were divided up as they were in 1992. And the most important, we did a lot of negotiation. We did a lot of negotiation, sort of constantly with the Chinese, and I already alluded to the big joint announcement of targets in 2014. In 2015, though, our follow-up with China was to negotiate, aiming toward what we knew was going to be a joint meeting between President Obama and President Xi in September in Washington, that we wanted to work through as many of the key elements of the Paris Agreement with the Chinese as possible to develop understandings, which would either be private or if we could capture them in a joint statement for the two presidents, that much better. And we started, my Chinese counterpart, by the way, became a great friend of mine over the years. I think he and I were two of the. There weren't too many other people in the world of climate ministers, and for this purpose, I was our climate minister, that lasted as long as we did. Right? If you look at the people who were there in 2009 and who was there in 2015, Stern and Shia were a pair of the a couple of the only old dogs who were still doing this. So a great friend, but also a real friend and adversary at the same time. But we worked through that joint statement over a period of about 6 months, meeting every month in 2015. And the last piece of it that we got done was just a couple of weeks before the presidents met in Washington. We were at the first joint U.S.-China Cities Summit, something that was an outgrowth of the 2014 joint announcement, and this was in Los Angeles, and it was actually a great event, mostly not focused on the negotiations per se, but on actions that cities could take. But Shia was there, I was there, Sue was there, and we met offline to try to finish the joint statement, and we were talking about transparency, and we negotiated language in there which said essentially that we would negotiate a transparency system. Didn't say one, but it said I think an enhanced system of transparency that should provide flexibility to those developing countries that need it in light of their capacities. So that's exactly what we wanted. So not just because you were a developing country. If you were China, if you were any number of developing countries with adequate capacity, you should be fully into the game. And we negotiated that sentence in that bilateral for that bilateral joint statement, and then became a sentence in the Paris Agreement itself, which I still regard as one of the pivotal sentences in the transparency section.
Okay, so those were questions kind of about the past, and I want to turn to a couple questions about the future going forward. I don't want to focus on the U.S. situation in particular yet. That will be the next question.
On the U.S.?
We're not going to focus on the U.S. until the next question, right? Because that could distract us. But I want to ask a more generic question about the Paris Agreement and how resilient you think it is. Given that it's not just a short-term agreement that ends in 2030, but it's a long-term agreement, many countries are going to have changes in government over the years during which they'll be sort of more or less interested in the climate issue. I mean, probably, right? So do you think Paris is resilient enough? Is that framework resilient enough to work in the long term And how might you keep countries engaged in the agreement even though there are likely to be bumps along the road?
Well, I hope so. It should be. I think it will be. I think that it's going to get put to a much earlier test than we were hoping that it would be, because of the question that I think you're going to ask me next about the U.S. But there was a tremendous amount of buy-in by the end of the Paris Agreement, really very broadly. There was a hiccup on the floor of the big plenary for that final moment when the agreement was going to get agreed to, and was. But the hiccup had nothing to do with the broad buy-in that the agreement had. I think that countries, around the world, there is a great deal of belief in the notion that climate change is a serious, serious threat. I think that that unfortunately the signals that we will continue to get from nature are going to make that conviction stronger and stronger and stronger as we go forward. I mean, it's just in the nature of the beast. I mean, whether you're talking about sea level rise or pressure on water supplies or droughts or floods or storms, or all of this stuff is accelerating. It's all happening worse than it was before, and indeed usually at the high end or beyond the high end of what predictions were. So that's going to keep, that in itself, almost more than anything else, will continue to keep pressure on people and countries and accelerate that pressure. It's not like, I mean, again, I profoundly wish I turned out to be wrong about this, but there's no basis to think that what I just said isn't the case. So countries are already bought in. They're already facing serious risks. They thought Paris, on balance, was a fair agreement that everybody could buy into. I think that you can't deal with climate change, as I said earlier, unless you have an international regime, because nobody's going to be prepared to act unless they see others act. So that if you lost Paris, you just have to recreate it. I mean, if there was no Paris, you'd have to start all over, and that'd be really, really hard. 2015 was a moment when the stars really aligned. You had super strong commitment in the White House, and you had a very for these purposes, a very strong relationship between the U.S. and China, and you had a lot of other factors. So I think that Paris will be resilient. I also think that kind of on the more positive side of this whole set of problems going forward, there's a tremendous amount of action in a good direction with respect to the development of clean energy. So the low carbon, the clean energy transformation of the global economy is fundamentally the solution side of climate change. There's also very important things that need to happen with respect to land use, but the biggest piece is the energy system. And if you look at what's been happening with respect to the competitiveness, the cost of solar and wind, where that's getting developed, the developing world has now surpassed the developed world in terms of the amount of clean energy that's getting developed and the pace at which that's getting developed. The cost competitiveness between solar, wind, and fossil there's been tremendous advancement, really stunning advancement on that front. So you're going to have, and we're not very far away from the point where solar, photovoltaics, and wind is going to be, in fact, in many places we're already there, but very broadly cheaper than coal or oil, well, oil is a little different situation, but oil is a different situation. But you have just as interesting developments in the economy and in the tech economy on that because of electric vehicles. And projections, I think, from some very solid think tanks about the tremendous uptake that is coming with respect to electric vehicles. So the solution side of this whole problem is going to get more and more and more potent. So I think that is also a factor that I think will help to make Paris resilient. Again, the thing that's going to be the biggest challenge is the one we haven't talked about yet.
But we're about to.
Okay.
So the next question is U.S. specific, and I was going to assume for purposes of this question that the U.S. is going to scale back its participation in some way, whether it's withdrawing completely from the Paris Agreement or staying in the Paris Agreement and changing the current 26 to 28% reduction target, or not even maybe staying in, not changing the target, but just not really being a climate leader as it was in the last administration. So what effect do you think that will have on other countries, including China? I mean, President Xi, I think, announced at Davos that they were staying in no matter what the United States did. But what do you think, what impact will that have? Another question related, is there another country that could potentially play the U.S. role? And what happens to all the hard-fought compromises that the U.S. has basically been protecting since Paris? So, the moving beyond the Kyoto Protocol paradigm of developed versus developing was very much pushed by the U.S. If we're not there, kind of defending the non-bifurcation, does that go backwards, or do other countries step up and protect the integrity of the Paris regime?
Okay, that's a good set of questions. But in terms of whether they would actually seek to pull out of Paris, I said I doubted. I doubt that in the end they would do that, if for no other reason that it would produce huge collateral damage with countries all over the world who would be hugely upset with the United States for doing this. And I don't mean just upset in a way that would affect climate change, but would affect the overall relationship. And we saw an episode which produced a lot of collateral damage in the past, right? When George W. Bush came in, he quickly pulled out of Kyoto. Kyoto, by the way, there's a lot more justification to pull out of Kyoto than Paris. there was a lot of good effort put into it, but it was a very flawed agreement. And that the United States was, at that point, clearly not going to be able to join. But even so, that action was the sort of first, to the rest of the world, telltale sign of a unilateralist kind of cowboy foreign policy. And there was a lot of negative feeling about the U.S. engendered by that. This would be way, way worse. Parenthetically, as a de jure matter, as a matter of formal matter, nobody can pull out of the agreement for 4 years because it has already entered into force. And a parenthetical on the parenthetical, the fact that the U.S. Successfully worked with other countries to get the Paris Agreement into force in 1 year was shocking. I mean, it is just a ridiculously short period of time to have an agreement of this scope and size brought into force that quickly. There was a really strong commitment coming from President Obama himself. He wanted the agreement to be done while he was still there, and because of that, had that not happened, we could have been out with a stroke of the pen. Now it's a four-year process. I think you have to, Sue, you'll know this. I think you have to wait 3 years in order to. After you've joined, before you can pull out, and then you have to wait a year after you've declared your desire to pull out. Having said that, they could pull out of the kind of granddaddy treaty, which this is essentially an implementing agreement to, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They could do that within a year. Or more likely, they could just, without being formally out, they could be out de facto. This agreement is dead to us. We're going to pay no attention to it. We don't care about any of the provisions. We're not going to participate. We won't be there. We're not going to attend. We're not going to pay any attention to our target, etc. We'll pull out formally when we can. They can do that, and that would have the same effect. Okay, but I don't think they're going to do that. I didn't think they were going to do that. I still hope they're not going to do that. I still think that I'm still kind of hanging on to Tillerson's comment that we should have a seat at the table, which is what he said in his confirmation hearings. But supposing the U.S. scales back, and the U.S. is certainly going to scale back in some fashion. So if they do nothing more than the domestic stuff that I talked about, that will send a message to the rest of the world that we're not going to meet our target, and we're not super serious about meeting our target. And I suspect that it's quite plausible that there'll be negative signals even more than that. But again, I'm not there now. I don't know. I think that it will certainly have an impact. I think on the one hand, even if the U.S. completely walked away, I don't think the agreement would collapse. I think other countries will stay in there. I think the fact that China has said that they would stay in there is very important. I think that countries, if for no other reason, that they wouldn't want to give the United States the satisfaction to think that they could pull the whole thing down. So I think that, and you have the buy-in that I talked about earlier. So I don't think that's going to happen. The dicier questions are the last two that Sue asked. Is there somebody who steps up into the kind of leadership position of the U.S.? I don't think so, really. I mean, I think that there will be countries who try to act together toward positive progress. I think the EU will certainly do that. I think the so-called High Ambition Coalition, which is a group of, ultimately included the EU and the US and the small island states who are very influential in this world, various progressives. There's a group of progressive Latin countries like Chile and Colombia and Costa Rica and others. So I think there'll be a lot of effort to move things forward, but there will be a vacuum. And I've talked to, I won't name the country, but a former colleague of mine from a minister from another country called me the other day just to bounce some things off of me, and I've talked to a handful of people around the world, and I do feel a little bit like the kids who are playing in the sandbox just looked up and like mommy and daddy aren't there anymore, and there's a little bit of like, what do we do? Who's going to call the next major economies forum meeting, which is a group of the major developed and developing countries that we created, pulled together, held 3 or 4 meetings every year to kind of work through the toughest issues, like kind of what's going to happen. So I think that I wish I could say, yes, I think this country is going to be the new United States if we're on the sidelines, but I don't think that's probably, it's not going to work quite like that. There'll be efforts to make progress, obviously. The last question was whether, so we did the agreement, but as is usually the case when there's an overall large-scale agreement, there are more detailed guidelines that have to get worked out with respect to various issues, and I'll talk about the one that we've already on the issue we've already discussed a good deal, transparency. So we have an excellent article that we negotiated with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in the Paris Agreement, but it still calls for further guidelines, more detailed guidelines about what countries should do. The effort to re-bifurcate, remember, developing countries, separation, firewall for so many years between them, we don't have to do anything, you do, et cetera, et cetera. Starting all the way back in 2009, we were working against that, chipping away at it. Paris makes the most progress that had ever been made in the direction of not having that sort of firewall. If the U.S. is not really playing, will there be efforts in the context of negotiating those guidelines, which are due at the end of 2018, to, in effect, re-bifurcate so that it's clear that developed countries have to do X and developing countries have to do a half or a quarter X? Will that happen? Yes, I absolutely think. I think if Hillary Clinton were president and we were in full out, there would be some of those efforts. It's just that we would be in a much stronger position to resist them. So I think that's a danger. And I think, to me, the thing that I care about the most with respect to, or that I'm sort of the most focused on with respect to international climate, is that that the regime get elaborated in ways that are consistent enough with the letter and spirit of Paris, so that when the song comes around on the guitar again, a better song in the United States, and you have a new, more moderate regime in Washington, there's still a good agreement that can get docked into when the thing hasn't gotten sort of knocked off the rails in various ways that would spoil that. So I think that's really important.
All right, why don't we take some questions in the next 10 minutes or so?
Hi, so I'm wondering if you guys have any familiarity with the issue of dealing with the times conflicting goals of the leader of a country and the local entities within it. In particular, I've been reading some concerning things recently about how China, even though it vows to meet its targets, has several of its local governors actually pushing for many more coal plants and
Right.
coal to gas facilities, stuff like that, which actually would make it much harder to meet the targets.
Right.
So in these international negotiations, how do you deal with the fact that a country may actually not be fully in control of the regional forces that might help it achieve its goal or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the issue of essentially what we might call state and local or provincial and local entities, that can sort of cut in two different directions. So you focused on the potentially negative side of that. I've heard similar things about China now, a push from some of those entities to ramp up cement production, steel production, like heavy greenhouse gas polluting production, more than the central government wants. I think it's, I think that it is, in the first instance, the pressure on that and calling attention to that needs to come from other national governments interacting with the Chinese central government. The fact that there is a capacity for the local authorities to go their own way to the extent that they do it's tough for other countries to really be able to get into what happens in China in that regard. I think, but I think pressure can be, again, if you imagine we were like our guys, the people who were there for the previous 8 years were still there. That would certainly be an issue that we would raise with the Chinese, and there, and you look to have that raised not just by governments but by other players, in the press and civil society and so forth, to try to encourage a strong enough response by the central government. My guess is that there will be a meaningful response there, but it's hard to say. The other side of that, though, is that take a look at the United States. I mean, one of the things that so let's assume, for the sake of argument, that things go fairly dark in Washington with respect to climate change over the next few years. One of the things I have also been focused on is the need for, to the greatest extent possible, that there could be ramped up action in progressive states and cities in the United States, and that such action could be, if you will, packaged and conveyed to the international community, even to have a platform in the international community where state and local entities can talk about what they're doing. I think that would be very important for the U.S. and for the international community, frankly, because I think it would be a quite good thing if the message were conveyed internationally that whatever's going on in Washington, you have these other important pockets of influence and power, which might add up, depending on how many of states and cities you got engaged. Maybe you're talking about 30 or 40 or 50% of U.S. population, GDP, emissions, et cetera, who are engaged in a positive way. that would be in contradistinction to the sense that I think people had internationally from 2001 to 2008 that the U.S. was just out of the game. I think it's important to try to convey that there's a lot of action going on in the U.S., including by the corporate sector. Yeah.
As sort of a variant on what he's talking about, the President has talked a lot about redeveloping infrastructure. Indirectly, could the development of infrastructure basically play down climate change? So, for instance, money being directed toward pipelines as opposed to being directed toward improving the electrical grid to allow for more solar and wind distribution of energy.
Yeah, obviously it could go either way. I mean, I think despite any orientation that the Trump administration has, the notion that we will see new building of coal plants, I think, is highly unlikely. I think the economics just don't work, and they're long-lived assets. People are going to know that. I mean, even if this is an 8-year administration, it's not long-lived in that sense. But obviously, you know, you could be more or less focused or tuned to even if you're not thinking about this in terms of climate change, you could. I mean, the best thing that could happen for these purposes it relates to what you're talking about, and not just the grid in the sense of making the grid smarter and more capable of handling solar or wind. That'd be good, but also there has been a problem. You know, I was in the Obama transition. One of the issues that we talked about in the Obama transition was, could we get large-scale, you know, heavy-duty, big transmission lines built from the centers of the sort of most important centers where wind and solar are produced into the, you know, what the people in the electricity business call the load centers, where the demand is, to the big cities. So you've got, you know, the Midwest and the Plain States, the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas and all the way down that part of the country, sometimes referred to as the Saudi Arabia of wind. But that's not where people live. I mean, not some people, but not, you know, but not the big population centers. So you need big transmission lines, and you have an eternal problem in the U.S. of permitting and you know, the sort of not in my backyard problem. You know, the Trump administration could make that part of their plan, and that could have actually quite a positive effect. They wouldn't do it for climate change, but there's a lot of red states that are going gangbusters on renewable energy, not because they think it's that they're so switched on to climate, but you know, Texas is huge on wind. I think the biggest in the country. On a percentage basis, Iowa I think has over 30% of its electricity from wind now. There's a lot of states that make money from this burgeoning growth of solar and wind. So with some luck, we'll get some infrastructure that helps that.
This is a question about your experience kind of in negotiations internationally, and I'm wondering to what extent the climate change denial movement in the United States hampered your ability to kind of negotiate for or move towards any kind of climate agreements.
Yeah, thanks. So I sort of say yes and no. Our whole approach, to sort of go back to something that I said a little bit earlier, we had been through the Kyoto experience, and I knew for a certainty that we could not have an agreement that seemed one-sided, an agreement that seemed like it was too easy on China, given the lack of support for climate change in the most important institution for these purposes, which is the U.S. Senate. Right? The Senate is the one that, if the agreement, this is a whole separate issue that we haven't discussed now, but some international agreements need to go through advice and consent and get 2/3 of Senate votes, and some don't. It all depends on the way the agreement is negotiated, what the words say, what the overall context is. But whether we were going to need advice and consent, which clearly was one possibility, or not, a violent opposition in the Senate would be a probably killing fact for any agreement coming out of a negotiation process. So, and some of that opposition is in turn, some of that, the reality of the way the Senate looks at climate is in turn derives from that denialist strain in the U.S. public. And the reality is the Senate is more denialist than the public is at this point. But that's just according to polling and stuff. So that was a backdrop. At the same time, and that there was a backdrop which had a big influence on the kind of agreement that we were looking for and the way we negotiated with respect to particular elements of the agreement, including the legal form of the agreement. But on the other hand, it's not, the fact of that sort of denialist strain. When we would negotiate, people knew we weren't. That's not where we were coming from. It's not where our administration was coming from. It's not where a fairly large majority of the U.S. public's coming from. So, I think people would kind of go like, "What is with the U.S.?" But that didn't. They wouldn't hold that against us. It just, in that a little bit deflected way, did have an impact on how we could negotiate.
If the counterfactual held and Hillary had won, how much would this agreement, the Paris climate change agreement, have worked to keep the climate below 2 degrees centigrade?
Well, I think that the Paris Agreement, it's the necessary but not sufficient condition, right? To use the terms from philosophy. And I remember, President Obama came to the State Department to talk to our whole team after it was all over, and what he said was, "You've given us the chance now. Paris has given us a chance." By creating that structure, by having all countries in, by having that cyclical quality that I talked about, and the transparency system and all the rest. But it's fundamentally got to happen by a significantly accelerated transformation to clean energy, plus some important work on the land use side against deforestation and having to do with a whole number of issues regarding the use of lands and forests. I think Paris did something beyond creating that structure, though, which I think is also very important, which is Paris sent an unmistakable signal that I think was received in countries, in corporate boardrooms, among civil society and all sorts of participants and observers in this world, which is, okay, this is finally really happening after 20 plus years of trying. There's a real agreement here that's got the buy-in of leaders all over the world, and with very strong targets, and coming out of that, you see analyses that have been done by whether it's Shell Oil or Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or just a whole slew of major players saying, okay, if we're going to hit the below 2 degree goal, this is what it will take. This is what the energy mix needs to look like for electricity, in 2030 and 2040. This is what needs to happen with respect to the penetration of electric vehicles, which does not mean at all that if you kind of look at whether it's in corporate America or even in the policy community in Washington, that people really get yet how fast this has to go, because I think mostly they don't. But it's a big step forward from where it was before Paris, and I think has put us on the way. But and I think some of those developments that I was talking about in the real economy regarding renewables and stuff are very, very helpful. But this is a huge, big challenge. It is a doable challenge from the point of view of innovation and policy and financing. All of those things are very much doable. The trick, the fourth element, is the politics, and that's the toughest.
So, given the already kind of embedded challenges in Paris in terms of the 2-degree target, and that it was very ambitious, and I think you're right that at multiple levels, corporate and otherwise, people don't get how fast this would have to happen. And you layer on top of that the now political uncertainty that you guys, I think talked about in detail for the U.S. Is there anything interesting to say, or is there anything happening with countries starting to talk about adaptation and how countries should think about cooperation around spending and response in a world where it seems like at this point it's less likely that we will hit the 2-degree target? We could be looking at a range of scenarios above 2. Some of them are potentially more catastrophic than others. How will countries? What will be kind of the process for working together, if there even will be one?
So for starters, I'm actually not conceding anything on meeting the below 2-degree target. I think we have to meet the below 2-degree target, and I think that we still can. It's going to take a lot, but I think that the consequences are really very serious about the sense that I think a lot of people have, even well-meaning people, that, so you don't do 2, 3 is still better than 4. I don't think there's, I think if you dig into the science, you don't feel very good about that at all. So I would not go there. Having said that, I think even if we don't go there, if you look at what's happening right now, and where we are right now is at about 0.9 degrees Celsius increase from pre-industrial. So we're not even halfway to 2 degrees, and what's happening in the real world and nature is quite striking. So I think you could hold below 2 degrees and still have a huge imperative and need for adaptation, which is, adaptation refers to building resilience within countries, within villages and cities and states and provinces and so forth, to resist impacts of climate change and to deal with the impacts that happen anyway, that you can't stop. That's a tremendous focus, actually, in the international community. If you think about it, there's probably more than 100 countries who together don't amount to much at all in terms of emissions, that are very small in terms of emissions, but that are tremendously vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And their focus in the negotiations for years has been much more centrally devoted to adaptation than mitigation. But I made my first point, though, because I think the notion that, we're not going to make it on mitigation, so let's adapt really well, I think that's a false path, because I think that we have to go, that we're not going to be able to adapt our way out of the level of danger and threat that's going to be facing us. But you've got to do both. And President Obama actually focused quite a bit on adaptation. That we had the big national assessment in the United States of I think it was the 3rd assessment, but it was a very important report on the need for building resilience and adaptation capacity in the United States. But also he took any number of actions that had to do with making information data available, kind of data that's high quality data from satellites and stuff that can be made available to countries around the world so that they can, for example, get early warning when a storm or a tsunami or something like that is coming, and to help generally to build capacity to either to build resilience or adaptation. But I think that's hugely important. But I really encourage everybody not to think about, well, we're not going to make it, so we're going to adapt, because it won't work.
All right, I think we need to wrap it up. So, okay, time for one more? Okay, so how about here?
Thank you. There's a lot to address in a question. You mentioned that there's this counter-narrative that between national and local, there's opportunity to move if one goes in the wrong direction in addressing the reality. What is your estimate of the ability of the grassroots movement efforts to divest from the banks in this country that are funding the pipelines that are really organized to tap into the Alberta tar sands, and the corporations that are pushing that, both the banking and the oil industry and the private wealth, in its effectiveness to put pressure on retarding the expansion of fossil fuel use?
Yeah, well, so I think my guess is that broadly the divestment movement with respect to fossil fuels is going to grow, I would expect. You see it on college campuses and things like that now. I don't really have any prediction about how large and how effective that might be, but it could be an important piece of the equation. I'll tell you what I think is potentially even more important, and that's an effort, it's essentially a disclosure effort that Mark Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England, has really given rise to. He wrote a very important article in September of 2015, I think, which I would encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at, which basically was focused on the notion that if you're serious at all about the 2-degree goal, the amount of fossil fuels, let's just talk about, it's all three of them, but especially coal and oil, that can come out of the ground is somewhere between 1/3 and 1/5 of what's there now. So that you've got massive potential for so-called stranded assets. And that the focus of his article was that was the impact on the markets if the markets didn't take this on board, can sort of continue to ignore this, that there would be an all of a sudden moment, where he referred to a Minsky moment, which I guess must refer to some historical meltdown of the markets when they found out, when they sort of suddenly realized some risk that they hadn't realized before. And so he then is also, he's governor of the Bank of England, but also the head of an important international financial body that I'm momentarily forgetting the name of. But and he set up a carbon disclosure task force underneath that rubric, and put Mike Bloomberg in charge of it. And they've put out one report now already, but the idea is essentially to force, in the first instance, to encourage, but certainly to try to get to a point where companies are forced to disclose the extent to which their assets are dependent on fossil fuels, so that players in the market can start to value those companies appropriately. If companies, if you think about a company whose valuation is heavily based on a level of fossil fuel exploitation that's inconsistent with what's called for in agreements like Paris, that's going to start. This is Carney's theory, at least. That's going to start to cause valuations to drop, and I think it will cause valuations to drop and gradually, put pressure on fossil fuels in that way. It's just a different piece than divestment. divestment may catch on also. I don't know.
Okay, now we really do have to stop. So, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.